Alright, I'm Parker Krause, and for the presentation I'm going to talk about brutalist architecture and then talk about some examples here in Iowa State. Brutalism was a big movement from the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s. It's known for the concrete form of things. The word brutalism comes from the French term for raw concrete, which Le Corbusier used to describe some of the post-World War II buildings. It comes from modernism, Corbusier being one of the founders of modernism. And another big inspiration for some of the brutalist work was Mies van der Rohe. It's not a brutalist building, but some of the techniques applied to it. This was made by students of Mies van der Rohe's Lake Point Tower in Chicago, Illinois. And it was inspired by his 1922 design for a glass curtained skyscraper. And what it uses is it plays with light with different geometries and angles, which brutalists use to make kind of the big buildings more interesting, otherwise they're very plain. It's exaggerated here in Bessie Hall, but it's also relevant with Wallace Wilson, and then the Maple Willow Larch buildings. So you do some things on the surface to make it more interesting. And another characteristic is some of the buildings have a more bunker-like feel, and that's a result of the concrete construction and some of the construction techniques that go along with that. And some of those, for a lot of the buildings, they were made on site with poured concrete rather than prefabricating parts in factories. And this, it was more labor intensive, but it was also more cost efficient. And you can see some of the details, the lines where you can see where the wood forms were, and you're also probably familiar with this in the College of Design, where you can see the wood crane on the concrete, and that's from the forms. And while the cost effectiveness made it good for universities, a lot of university buildings were made this way, especially dormitories and residence halls. And even though they were boring in design, they also seemed to reference some older things. In that last picture, the way they used the glass references, it references Julie Schulman's picture of one of the case study houses in Los Angeles, which was a big part of modernism. This is the Fisher Theater, and it's by the same architect that does this Kreitz and the Stevens Auditorium. Is Kreitz and McDonald, and they also did a famous church in Dansville, Illinois, which is in the same kind of style. Here, this is Stevens Auditorium, and I like it because the roof plays with weight. When you're driving by in Lincoln Way, the roof almost looks suspended above. And the stairwells on Stevens, as well as the exterior here, reference form. That's a big thing with both modernism and especially brutalism. They let the form kind of relegate what it would look like outside, so you can see the second balconies here. So then going in the interior, this also reflects the concrete construction. Here it's more, like some of them were more cavern-like here, you can see. And despite the geometries being very unnatural, the material somehow gave it a strange natural feel. Like I said, cavern or cave-like. But then they weren't always square and geometric. This is the Seventh Christian Church of Science in Chicago, Illinois, I believe is the name of it. And this is another modernist building. I think it was built in 1964. Or not modernist, brutalist. And they use more organic shaping in that. So this slide demonstrates the construction. I said they used poured concrete, and there's also reinforced steel most of the time. And this was, like I said, cost efficient, but then depending on the materials, it could also be weak to weather and aging. And that was a case in the Knapp and Storm Towers, which were the same as Wilson and Wallace. And those were imploded in 2005 due to the concrete had a lot of iron in it, and it wasn't keep holding up to the elements. They're also tearing down more things, use the walkways at the Iowa State Center, which were part of the original design back in 1965. And as brutalism is getting phased out, it's getting replaced with more modern what people call more modern architecture, but it's not necessarily more interesting. I took a walk around campus to figure out what they're replacing things with, and I found a lot of it's all the same. So brutalism has a lot of critics, but then the more modern stuff is also not as interesting as we'd expect it to be. Questions? Comments? Graham?
I really like your presentation on how you approach like all the buildings and your topics. I've never heard of like your topic before, and I think I've learned a lot from it.
Okay, thank you.
I really like how you used examples of buildings around campus so we can like relate to it. That was good.
Thank you. Any comments?
Yeah, so other than like calling it modernism, like what kind of style would you say like between the Pavilion and Hoover and like the new one they're building next to it?
Well, I don't know if that necessarily reflects modernism. Modernism is being more sleek. A lot of them are very, they're not ornate, but they have a lot of facades that don't necessarily reflect form. I do like King Pavilion a lot. I think that's a more modernist example, but like the aerospace building, and a lot of the other ones I think are just a little more showy, so they look better on campus tours. Any other comments?
I like how you didn't use note cards. It just felt like you really knew your stuff really well.
Yeah, I felt it was really obvious that you knew it. And this is an outstanding presentation because you did go out and look around here and see what it was and what you could contrast it with. When I first came to this campus, it's like more than 30 years ago, so some of these buildings were considerably newer. And I remember my first impression is I couldn't believe all these long rust spots coming out of the concrete. Because I guess back where I come from in Ohio, when we used concrete to do that, we didn't see all those rust spots. So does that reflect that the materials are coming pretty locally in this kind of art or the architecture, or what? Because I've never seen that kind of bleeding concrete that these buildings had even 30 years ago.
Yeah, I think it depends on where they get their concrete from, and that's especially true in the Wilson buildings.
Yeah.
Over there, you see a lot of that. But it also depends on maintenance and upkeep. The reason that when storms went down is because there wasn't as much maintenance as those buildings needed going on there.
Well, there were also other things. I happened to be working in student affairs when they were imploded, when the plan was made. And they simply were not the kind of dormitories anybody wanted to live in anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
And so they kind of deliberately neglected them for a while with the idea they were going to be phased out anyhow. They kept them a little longer than they had planned because of fluctuations in enrollment and because, weirdly enough, even though they did not have air conditioning, they were being used for summer programs. But yeah, they weren't, they just weren't set up the way people would want, the kind of things. That's, at the point they were imploded was after they had begun to build some of the newer apartment style residential facilities.
That's why they brought Wallace back as a super suite building, I guess, or the super single things.
Yeah. Right. No, I thought it was just an excellent job. Did you take the photographs or did you find them elsewhere, or what did you?
No, I took all the photos.
Just excellent. They really illustrate the points well, and great presentation.